Can you imagine what you would do if you found a child asking to bury his own sister? This is not just a rhetorical question. It is the beginning of a true story that will challenge the way you see the value of life and the power of a single gesture of compassion. Roberto Azevedo had always been a meticulous man, president of a large technology company in Recife. He was constantly caught up in commitments, numbers, and decisions that moved millions. In the eyes of others, he was a successful, respected man, as solid as the concrete of the buildings he helped erect with his investments. But behind this facade was a broken man. Since losing his wife 3 years earlier, Roberto had turned his routine into a shield. He always woke up at 5 in the morning, reviewed reports before breakfast, and immersed himself in work until there was no room left to think about anything else. For him, living had become nothing more than completing tasks. On that muggy December morning, the sun seemed more cruel than usual. The hot air clung to the skin as if it wanted to take the breath away from passers-by. Roberto walked down Aurora Street, fresh from a $1 million meeting with foreign investors. For any other businessman, it would have been a day of celebration, but for him, there was no joy. The deals were just cold numbers, unable to fill the silence that had echoed in his home since Clara's death. As he crossed the busy streets of the historic center, he observed without really seeing street vendors loudly advertising their wares, tourists photographing old mansions, hurried workers balancing styrofoam lunchboxes. It was all part of a daily choreography that he knew by heart, but that no longer touched him. The world went on, alive, noisy, full of haste, and he inside remained inert. That's when he heard it, a sound almost swallowed up by the noise of the streets. It wasn't moose, Ike. It wasn't conversation. It was crying. Low, restrained, but so deep that it seemed to carry centuries of pain. Roberto stopped instinctively, as if that sound had pulled something inside him that had been dormant. He thought about moving on. How many times had he ignored cries for help? The city was full of sad stories, but there was something different about that voice, a raw, unarmed desperation, impossible to pretend he hadn't heard. Following the sound, his steps led him to a narrow alley between peeling brick walls that seemed to hold dark secrets. Light barely penetrated inside, leaving the environment in an almost gray, stuffy tone. And it was at the end of that alley that Roberto saw her, a small girl, no more than 8 years old, sitting on the uneven ground. Her brown hair fell in tangled strands over her dirt-marked face. Her clothes, made of worn scraps, were soaked with dust and sweat. Her bare feet showed cuts and calluses from walking too much in hostile places. But it wasn't just this scene of misery that froze Roberto's heart. In the girl's fragile arms lay a 2-year-old baby, motionless like a forgotten doll. Her fair skin was cold and colorless, her dry lips cracked with every non-existent breath, her little body too limp to seem merely asleep. The contrast was brutal, the suffocating heat of the morning and the coldness of the silent child. The girl's eyes lifted, brown, brimming with tears. They carried a mixture of innocence and despair that no adult should have to bear, let alone a child. And then, with a trembling voice, she said words that would echo forever in Roberto's mind. "Sir, can you bury my little sister? She didn't wake up today, and she's very cold. I don't have the money for a nice funeral, but I promise I'll work and pay you when I grow up." For a few seconds, time stood still. Roberto felt as if he had been struck in the chest. The girl's words pierced his armor as a man accustomed to business and figures, and touched precisely the wound he tried hardest to hide. The memory of Clara, his wife, wasting away before his eyes without him being able to save her. Now, in front of that child, the helplessness returned like a wave. He tried to look around for an adult, someone who was responsible for those girls, but the alley was empty. Just him, the girl, and the fragile body she believed was no longer alive. The silence was heavy, broken only by the child's restrained crying, which seemed to beg not only for help, but for someone to finally see her. Roberto did not respond immediately. His legs seemed glued to the ground and he was short of breath. What could he say in the face of such a cruel, innocent, and devastating request? At that moment, he understood something that would change the course of his own life. The time had come when he could no longer hide behind numbers, reports, and meetings. The weight of that scene demanded a decision. The silence of the alley seemed to crush every thought in Roberto's mind. He was still paralyzed in front of the girl when an almost instinctive impulse made him kneel down. He approached cautiously, as if afraid to confirm what he already knew, and reached out to touch the baby's little body. The cold he felt when his fingers touched her pale skin was like a stab in the heart. But Roberto didn't give up. He touched his fingertips to her fragile neck, searching for the most unlikely sign. For seconds that seemed like an eternity, nothing. And then, a pulse, weak, almost imperceptible. But it was there. The girl wasn't dead. Roberto's heart raced. The air that had not come since he entered the alley now entered at once, gasping as if he had awakened from a nightmare. He looked at the girl with teary eyes, who continued to hold her sister in her arms as if she were holding the world itself. "She's alive," he said, his voice breaking. "Your sister is still alive." The reaction was immediate. The girl's eyes widened, a mixture of hope and disbelief, as if she had heard a miracle. "Are you sure?" she whispered, hugging the baby's little body even tighter. "She hasn't moved since last night. She's so cold." Roberto took a deep breath. He knew there was no time to lose. He picked up his cell phone with trembling hands and dialed the Portuguese hospital, where he still had contacts because of the donations he had been making quietly since his wife's death. The firm voice of an experienced doctor answered on the other end. "Dr. Henrique, this is Roberto Azevedo. I have a pediatric emergency. A child in critical condition. I'm bringing her now. Prepare the ICU." He didn't wait for a response. He hung up and reached out his arms to the girl. "Give me your sister. I need to take her now." For a moment, the little girl hesitated. Her brown eyes filled with tears assessed the man in a suit who had appeared out of nowhere. She didn't know who he was, but she knew she had no choice. With a delicate gesture, she passed the baby into Roberto's arms, who was surprised by how light she was for a child of that age. Her malnutrition was evident. "Come with me," he said firmly but gently. "I won't leave you alone." The girl picked up a crumpled plastic bag from the ground, the only possession she seemed to have, and ran after him. As they left the alley, the city remained noisy and indifferent, as if nothing had happened. But for Roberto, the world was no longer the same. He practically dragged the girl to the imported car parked on the corner. The doors closed with a metallic snap, muffling the noise of the streets once and for all. The silence inside the vehicle was broken only by Roberto's short breaths and the girl's quiet crying. He adjusted the baby in his arms, watching her tiny chest rise and fall with difficulty. The traffic in Recife seemed even more chaotic that day. Horns blaring, motorcycles weaving between cars, traffic lights turning red at the wrong time. Every second lost was torture. Roberto gripped the steering wheel tightly while the girl beside him sobbed softly. "I tried, sir," she murmured, almost without a voice. "I fed her first, always, but she started to get quiet, and today she didn't wake up. I thought she had gone to meet her grandmother in heaven." The girl's words pierced Roberto like blades. He felt the weight of responsibility growing in his hands. It wasn't just about saving a child. It was about not repeating the mistake of before, not letting death win once again before his eyes. When they finally arrived at the hospital, the medical team was already waiting for them at the emergency room door. Roberto handed the baby to the steady hands of the nurses, but he didn't let go right away. He had to hear the doctor say, "We'll take care of her from here," before he could open his arms. The girl grabbed his hand tightly, her eyes begging for a silent promise that he wouldn't leave her. Roberto squeezed back. The bond was sealed, and deep down he knew there was no turning back. That scene had torn apart his calculated routine and set him on a path from which he could never escape. If this story has caught your attention so far, subscribe to the channel now, because what comes next is even more intense and you won't want to miss it. The hospital doors closed behind Roberto with a dull thud. The baby disappeared into the hurried corridors, wrapped in the arms of doctors who were already shouting technical orders. He stood in the lobby, breathless, while the girl clung to his hand as if letting go would mean abandonment. Minutes later, a doctor emerged with a grave expression. "Her condition is critical, but there is still a chance. Severe malnutrition, advanced pneumonia. We need to act fast." Roberto nodded, but the gravity of those words hit him hard. It wasn't enough to have found the child alive. Now the real struggle began. The girl, who finally said her name was Leah, cried silently beside him. While waiting for news, a social worker approached him. The badge on her chest displayed her name, Marcia Torres. The irony of encountering the name of his dead wife did not escape him, and for a second he felt his chest burn. "Are you related to the child?" she asked in the bureaucratic tone of someone following protocol. "No," he replied curtly, "but I was the one who brought her here." Marcia's eyes narrowed. "Then we'll need your information. This girl can't just leave here with a stranger. The Child Protection Agency will be called." Those words were like ice poured down Roberto's spine. For the first time, he realized that he could lose Leah, that the system could snatch her from his hands at any moment. The little girl's grip on his fingers tightened, as if she understood too. In the days that followed, the tension only increased. Leah was seen by psychologists and nurses, but she wouldn't leave Roberto's side whenever he appeared. She slept in chairs next to him and refused food when he wasn't around. This moved the staff, but it also raised questions. Who was this man to deserve such trust? Roberto, for his part, was torn. Every time he looked at Leah, he saw his wife's face reflected in the last days of her life. The child's fragility poked at old wounds that he thought he had already buried. At night, alone at home, he stared at his glass of whiskey without drinking it and wondered if he had the strength to get involved again. After all, what would he do if he lost that girl too? The pressure didn't come only from within. Marcia, the social worker, seemed suspicious of his intentions. One day, she entered the makeshift room where Leah was resting and delivered her verdict. "There are families who have been registered for years on the adoption waiting list. What you did was noble, but it does. It mean you have any rights over them?" Roberto felt anger rising. "I'm not talking about paperwork right now. I'm talking about a child who needs immediate care. If I hadn't stopped in that alley, she would already be dead." The argument echoed through the hallways, leaving Leah cowering, afraid that everything would fall apart. Even in the midst of this storm, there were small glimmers of hope. One afternoon, while waiting for news about the baby, Leah took a crumpled object out of her plastic bag, a torn, almost illegible photo of an elderly woman smiling. "It's my grandmother. She took care of us." The girl's voice broke like glass. "After she died, we were left alone." Roberto held the photo carefully, as if it were too fragile to touch. That image, even faded, spoke of roots, of loss, of responsibilities that were too heavy for such small shoulders. The clock struck dawn when the doctor returned with news. "The baby survived the first night. It's still early, but she's responding." Leah burst into tears of relief, grabbing Roberto's arm as if she wanted to merge with him. It was at that moment that he understood. It wasn't just about rescuing two children. It was about rescuing himself from a meaningless life. The road ahead, however, was far from easy. The Child Protection Agency had already been informed. Investigations would be opened. There would be interviews, home visits, technical reports. Every step would be accompanied by suspicious glances and formal reports. However, Roberto was already too committed to back down, and every gesture Leah made, every glance, every word, every fear revealed, only increased his conviction that he could not leave her alone again. What about you? What would you do in Roberto's place? Would you face the system or let fate decide? Right here in the comments, I really want to know. The courtroom smelled of aged paper and waxed wood. The air conditioning was too cold, but Roberto was sweating inside his dark suit. Every step he took in the hallway echoed too loudly, as if all eyes were on him. At his side, Leah walked with her head down, squeezing his hand so hard that she seemed to want to merge with him. In the courtroom, the silence was almost oppressive. A long table, the judge with an impenetrable expression, the prosecutor on one side, social worker Marcia on the other, before them. Roberto felt the weight of the world resting on his shoulders. "Mr. Roberto Azevedo," the judge began in a firm voice, "we are here to assess the situation of the minors found under your responsibility." Bureaucratic words followed. Protocols, registrations, adoption queues, reports. But Roberto could barely hear. He could only feel Leah's small body trembling beside him. When the prosecutor stood up, the blow came hard. Your Honor, we must not forget that there are hundreds of families waiting years for legal adoption. The defendant is a powerful businessman, but that does not place him above the law. The word defendant fell on Roberto like an early sentence. His instinct was to stand up, fight back, shout that it was not about power, but about lives. But something held him back. Leah's pleading gaze, asking him not to leave her alone. The judge turned to her. Miss, can you tell me your name? Her voice trembled. I'm Leah. And what do you want to happen now, Leah? He asked without changing his tone. A thick silence filled the room. Leah took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on the judge, then on Roberto. Her voice was low, but firm, carrying the strength of someone who had experienced pains that did not belong in a childhood. I want to stay with him. He didn't let my sister die. He didn't let me be alone. The room stirred with murmurs. Marcia, the social worker, cleared her throat nervously. With all due respect, Your Honor, we cannot base a legal decision on the emotional appeals of a traumatized child. It was at that moment that Roberto exploded. He jumped up, his chair scraping across the floor like thunder. Traumatized? His voice came out louder than he intended. This girl is stronger than many adults I know. She took care of her sister on the streets, went hungry so she could feed the baby first. And yet here she is, standing, asking only not to be torn away from the only person she has left. The judge raised his hand, asking for silence, but Roberto did not back down. Your Honor, I lost my wife to an illness I couldn't beat. I spent 3 years hiding in reports and meetings because I didn't want to feel the pain of loss again. But when I found Leah and Julia in that alley, I realized I couldn't run away anymore. I chose to be here. I chose to fight for them, and I will fight to the end. The room fell silent. The sound of the air conditioning seemed louder, the seconds longer. Leah cried softly, but without letting go of his hand. The judge rested his arms on the table, looking over his glasses. His voice came out slow, drawn out, but with enough weight to cut through the air. The court recognizes the emotional bond that has been established. Considering the social risk, the evidence of immediate care, and the child's own statement, I grant temporary custody of the minors to Mr. Roberto Azevedo. The words echoed like a snap of liberation. Leah collapsed into his lap, sobbing, clinging to him as if she finally believed she was safe. Roberto closed his eyes and took a deep breath, feeling hot tears escape despite years of restraint. He knew that from then on, nothing would ever be the same. If this moment gave you goosebumps as much as it did me, leave your like now. It shows us that you want more intense stories like this. The courthouse hallway seemed longer on the way out than on the way in. Roberto walked slowly, as if each step weighed a ton. Leah walked hand in hand with him, her small plastic backpack swinging on her shoulder. Her face was still wet with tears, but her eyes reflected something new. It was no longer just fear, it was a timid, almost unbelievable hope. Outside, the city continued with its usual noise, horns, hurried voices, footsteps echoing on the sidewalks. But for Roberto, everything was silent. He barely felt the warm wind of Recife hitting his face. He could still hear the judge's voice echoing in his mind, repeating those words that changed the course of their lives. I authorized temporary custody. They got into the car without speaking. Leah leaned her head against the window, her eyes half closed, still tired from the weight of the last few days. Roberto started the engine, but didn't drive off immediately. He sat motionless for a few seconds, his hands on the steering wheel, breathing deeply. For the first time in years, there was no meeting waiting for him, no reports piled up on his desk. There was only the emptiness of not knowing what to do next. Mr. Roberto. Leah's voice broke the silence. He turned his face. Yes, dear. The judge said I can stay with you now, but what if one day you get tired of me? The words fell like stones. Roberto closed his eyes for a moment, trying to hold back his emotions. Then he leaned closer to her, placed his hand on her small shoulder, and spoke softly, almost in a whisper. I won't get tired of you, never. The car drove on. They arrived home at dusk. The mansion's gate opened slowly, revealing the perfectly manicured garden and the mirrored windows of the facade. For Leah, it was a strange world, far from the dusty streets and cold alley where she had lived with her sister. She hesitated before entering. Roberto noticed and bent down to her height. "This is your home now," he said firmly but gently. "You don't need to be afraid." Inside, the silence was different from the silence of the courthouse. There was too much space, too many white walls, too much expensive furniture. Roberto realized that despite all the luxury, his house seemed as empty as he had been before he met the girls. Leah dropped her plastic backpack in the corner of the room and stood still, looking around as if she were in forbidden territory. "Can I really stay here?" she asked. "Yes," Roberto smiled, even though his eyes were still red. This place never made sense until now. That night, Roberto hardly slept. He sat in the armchair in the bedroom, watching the half-open door to the room where Leah had fallen asleep for the first time in a real bed. Her body was curled up on its side, as if still expecting the cold of the floor, but her breathing was calm. For the first time since he had found her, she was sleeping peacefully. Roberto leaned his head back and closed his eyes, but the memories came back with a vengeance. Clara, his wife, fragile in her hospital bed, holding his hand in her last moments. He had never been able to save her, but now somehow he felt he was being called to a new purpose, to save those who could still be saved. The next morning he woke up before sunrise. He made coffee as he always did, but the kitchen didn't seem the same. On the table, next to the porcelain cup, was a child's drawing on a sheet of notebook paper, crooked lines forming 3 figures holding hands, a tall man, a girl with braids, and another smaller girl, smiling. Roberto stood motionless, staring at that drawing as if it were a silent contract. When Leah entered the kitchen, rubbing her still sleepy eyes, he held up the paper. "Did you do this?" She nodded shyly. "It's us, you, me, and my sister." Roberto's heart tightened. He carefully stored the drawing in a leather folder, as if filing away the most important document of his life. He knew that the days ahead would bring difficulties. The watchful eyes of social workers, endless bureaucracy, the fragility of the baby still recovering. But at that moment, nothing mattered more than the fact that he was not alone. For the first time in a long time, he had someone to call family. If this part really touched you, now is the time to support our channel. If you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe now. And if you're already part of our family, consider leaving a super thanks. It's a gesture that helps us continue bringing stories like this one. That morning seemed different from all the others. The sun shone through the windows of the mansion, no longer as a reminder of emptiness, but as an announcement of movement. Children's laughter echoed through the garden, mixed with the sound of the hose Leah was holding, watering the plants with an enthusiasm that only a free child could have. Julia, now recovered, ran after butterflies, tripping over her own legs, but always getting up with a smile. Roberto watched from afar, leaning on the balcony, a forgotten cup of coffee in his hand. He was no longer the man who woke up early just to review reports. Now the papers rested in piles that could wait. He had discovered something that no million-dollar meeting had ever offered him: the meaning of staying. The house was no longer silent nor as organized as before. Toys scattered across the hallway, drawings stuck to the refrigerator, a teddy bear forgotten on the sofa. Every detail was a reminder that this once cold mansion now breathed. For the first time in years, he was not afraid of the silence of the night. He knew that behind 2 doors, there were light breaths that kept him awake to life. Not everything was simple. The visits from social workers continued. There were papers to fill out, future hearings, daily adjustments. But inside, Roberto had already made the decision that changed everything. No matter how difficult it was, Leah and Julia were his family, and family is not negotiable. One night, sitting on the edge of the bed, he saw Leah enter the room with timid steps. "Can I ask you something?" "Gay," she said, holding a blanket. "Of course. Do you," she corrected herself hesitantly, "does Daddy think I'm too much of a burden?" Roberto swallowed hard. He knelt in front of her, held her small hands, and replied slowly, "You will never be a burden, Leah. You are the reason this house has light again." She smiled shyly, but her eyes sparkled. At that moment, he realized that it wasn't just the girls who were being rescued. He was too. What this story shows us is something you may have felt at some point in your life. It doesn't take blood for someone to become family. Sometimes a gesture of compassion at the right moment is enough. Sometimes all someone needs is a place where they can simply be. Not all pain can be healed, Not all trauma disappears. But when there is care, when there is presence, even the deepest scars find space to transform into strength. Roberto discovered this. And so did Leah. Perhaps this is the silent moral of this story. Love does not erase the past, but it is capable of writing new futures. And now I want to speak directly to you who have stayed with me this far. Have you noticed that in some way this story is also about you? Because all of us at some point have been like Roberto, trying to hide the pain behind tasks, numbers, or routines. And all of us at some point have been like Leah, just asking not to be left alone. If this story found you today, perhaps it is a reminder that you are not alone. There is always someone who can be touched by your gesture of attention, by your gaze, by your presence. Sometimes you are Roberto, other times you are Leah. And that's okay, because the most important thing is not to give up on connecting. Thank you for watching until the end. Stories like this aren't easy to tell, but they matter. They matter because they remind us of what really sustains life. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time to subscribe and be part of this community. And if you already have, consider supporting us with a super thanks. Every gesture you make strengthens our work and allows us to continue bringing you real stories that touch the soul. And don't stop there. If this story spoke to you, there's another one waiting for you right after, with the same intensity and truth. Maybe it will also find a piece of your heart that needs to be reminded that it is not alone. Because in the end, that's what it's all about. Sharing stories that cross borders, reach hearts, and remind us that love, when it is true, is never ending.